This is the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis.
This, without a doubt, is one of the most significant moments in British broadcasting for many years. Sky has agreed to acquire ITV's broadcast and streaming division in a deal worth up to £1.6 billion. On the surface, it looks like another corporate takeover, but I think it represents something much bigger than that. It reflects the enormous changes that have taken place across the television industry over the past decade and raises some fascinating questions about the future of British broadcasting. Sky and ITV have always occupied very different places in the television landscape. ITV has been part of everyday life for generations, bringing everything from Coronation Street and The Chase to major sporting events and Saturday night entertainment into millions of homes. Sky, meanwhile, built its reputation through premium sport, blockbuster films, high-end drama and subscription television. Although the two companies have often competed for audiences, they've always represented different approaches to television, which is why seeing them come together feels like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. What's particularly interesting is that Sky isn't buying the whole of ITV. ITV Studios, which has quietly become one of the UK's most successful production companies, will remain independent and continue producing programmes for broadcasters and streaming platforms around the world. And that feels like a sensible decision because ITV Studios has become a genuinely international business, supplying content to companies that would probably feel uncomfortable buying programmes from a direct competitor. By keeping that business separate, ITV preserves one of its strongest assets, while allowing Sky to focus on the broadcast and streaming side of the operation. When I first saw the news, my immediate reaction wasn't surprise, so much as inevitability. Over the past few years, it's become increasingly obvious that traditional broadcasters have been under immense pressure as audiences move away from scheduled television and towards on-demand streaming services. Companies like Netflix, Disney and Amazon are spending billions every year on original programming, and they're competing not only for viewers, but also for creative talent, production companies and advertising revenue. And that creates an environment where even long-established broadcasters can struggle to compete if they're trying to do everything on their own. And this is really where the logic behind the deal becomes easier to understand. ITV has invested heavily in ITVX, which has become a much stronger streaming platform than many people expected. But operating a modern streaming service is expensive. Viewers expect high-quality apps across every device, personalised recommendations, reliable streaming, and a constant supply of new content, all of which requires huge investment in technology, as well as programming. Sky already has much of that infrastructure in place through its own streaming products, so bringing ITV into that ecosystem could create efficiencies that simply weren't possible while the companies remained separate. Of course, making strategic sense on paper doesn't automatically mean the merger will be successful. Large acquisitions often promise far more than they eventually deliver, because integrating different organisations is rarely straightforward. Corporate cultures need to be aligned, technology platforms have to be combined, and management teams have to make difficult decisions about where costs can be reduced. Anyone who has watched major media mergers over the years will know that they often take much longer to deliver results than the initial announcements suggest. One aspect that particularly interests me is what happens to ITV as a brand. ITV isn't simply another television channel because it occupies a unique place in British culture. Generations of viewers have grown up with its programmes, its news coverage and its live events, and there's a familiarity and trust that has been built over decades. Sky has said that ITV's public service broadcasting commitments will continue, and I hope that proves to be true, because those obligations are part of what makes ITV different from purely commercial broadcasters. News, regional programming, and content that reflects communities across the UK all serve an important public purpose, and preserving that role should be every bit as important as achieving financial targets. I'm also curious about what happens in the streaming space, because while ITVX has grown significantly over the past couple of years, it now sits alongside Sky's own streaming services. It seems unlikely that the long-term plan is to operate multiple competing platforms indefinitely, so there'll certainly be decisions about whether the services are integrated, rebranded, or continue to exist separately. Whatever route Sky chooses, I suspect simplicity will be essential because consumers are already overwhelmed by the number of subscriptions and streaming apps they're expected to manage. Looking beyond the companies themselves, I think this deal says something important about the direction of the wider television industry. The distinction between broadcasters and technology companies has become so increasingly blurred because success is no longer determined simply by commissioning great programs. Modern media companies also need sophisticated streaming platforms, recommendation algorithms, advertising technology, and detailed audience data if they're going to compete effectively. In many ways, broadcasters have become software businesses as much as television companies, and that requires a level of investment that becomes easier to justify when organisations achieve greater scale. Personally, I find myself being both optimistic and slightly nostalgic. The optimist in me recognises that British broadcasters need to evolve if they're going to compete with global giants that have vastly greater financial resources. Standing still simply isn't an option, and consolidation may well be the only realistic way for domestic media companies to remain competitive over the next decade. If this partnership results in better technology, stronger investment in British programming, and a streaming experience that genuinely rivals the international platforms, then viewers could ultimately benefit. At the same time, there is part of me that will miss the rivalry between Sky and ITV, because competition has traditionally driven innovation across the industry. When broadcasters compete aggressively for audiences, they tend to invest more heavily in original content, improve their services more quickly, and take creative risks in order to stand out. Bringing two major players together inevitably changes that dynamic, and it remains to be seen whether the benefits of greater scale outweigh the loss of independent competition. Ultimately, I think the success of this acquisition won't be measured by the £1.6 billion price tag, or by what happens over the next few months. The real test will come several years from now, when viewers decide whether British television feels stronger, more innovative, and better equipped to compete internationally than it does today. If audiences enjoy better programmes, a smoother streaming experience, and continued investment in UK content, then this deal may eventually be remembered as the moment British broadcasting adapted to a rapidly changing world. If, however, it becomes primarily a story about cost-cutting and consolidation, people may look back on it rather differently. Either way, I don't think this is just another business story. It feels like one of those moments that marks a genuine shift in the media landscape, and I suspect we'll be discussing its consequences for many years to come.
This has been the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis, a Red Telephone Box production.